a special broadcast in Campaign 2000. WCCO 4 News and the League of Women Voters bring you a Senate debate.
Hello, I'm Don Shelby. Welcome to the McMillan Fine Arts Center at the Blake School in Hopkins. We're joined live by 4 of the candidates running for the United States Senate. Here's Judy Duffy, the president of the Minnesota League of Women Voters, for a word on our debate and the candidates. Judy.
Thank you, Don. We'd like to welcome everyone at home and those of you in our audience. The League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan organization that neither supports nor opposes political parties nor candidates, and the League is open to all citizens. Here are tonight's candidates. We drew numbers to decide the order in which they will respond to questions. First, the Independence Party candidate, James Gibson. Gibson. First, the Independence Party candidate, James Gibson. He's a software developer who bought his first company at age 21. He and his wife, Celeste, were married in 1982 and often compete in ballroom dancing. For the Republicans, U.S. Senator Rod Grams is running for re-election. Grams was born and raised on a Minnesota dairy farm. He worked as a president and CEO of a construction company, then spent nearly 25 years as a journalist before being elected to Congress in 1992. This is David Swan's first run for political office. He is endorsed by the Constitution Party. Swan is a computer analyst who was born in Iowa and has lived in Minnesota for 25 years. And Mark Dayton has served in several government jobs, including Minnesota's state auditor in the 1990s and legislative assistant to then Senator Walter Mondale in 1975 and 76. Dayton has also worked as a 9th grade science teacher in New York. He is the candidate from the Democratic Party. Those are the candidates in tonight's debate. Now here's Don with the first questions.
Thank you very much, Judy. Normally in debates, candidates answer the questions, and we'll do that. But we begin tonight by letting our candidates pose a few questions themselves. We asked each of them to prepare questions in advance. Each candidate will have 1 minute to respond. Up first, Mr. Gibson, and your question for Senator Rod Grams.
Well, Senator, this has been a tough campaign, and you've had some family problems to deal with as well. So my question to you is, how are you coping?
Well, Jim, you know, every campaign is a hard campaign, and it's hard fought. There's a lot of demands on your time besides trying to carry out the duties and responsibilities in Washington and all that goes with the office of the United States Senate. But I think it's like anything else. We're in the 2-minute drill, we're in the last minute or the last inning of a game, but really adrenaline takes over, and this is such an important race, and really so much hinges, I believe, on this election. And the work that I have done and started for the people of Minnesota, representing them in Washington, D.C., I think just the opportunity to go back and to finish work on that and to represent them for the next 6 years is a goal that keeps me going the 15, 18 hours a day we need to do in this campaign.
And thank you both. Now, Mr. Grams, please ask your question of Mr. Swan.
Who is that, Don? Did you ask?
I'm asking you, okay, Senator Grams, to ask a question of Mr. Swan.
Mr. Swan, what would you do to ensure the young generation today that there was going to be a retirement benefit for them when they retire?
Senator, I would, as a United States Senator, I would end the Social Security system while protecting the people who are currently trapped in a system that's a poor investment. The federal government has no constitutional authority to have implemented a Social Security system in the first place, and Unlike your system, which is only partially privatized, we would privatize the entire thing. It is not the responsibility of the federal government to guarantee the financial success of the younger generation. In fact, they can do a whole lot better job by themselves. And that's the plan, is to let them pursue their own dreams and fulfill their own destinies. And they'll do a lot better job without the government involvement.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. We now go to Mr. Swan. What is your question for Mr. Dayton?
Mr. Dayton, you've proposed spending huge volumes of money. And I'd like to ask you the question I asked you a week ago. Can you explain to me where in the Constitution the federal government has been delegated the authority to provide the health care system and the education funding that you propose?
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank the League of Women Voters for hosting this and say that I'm delighted to be back in my alma mater where I graduated, as my sons would say, back in the days when they used dinosaur bones for goalie sticks. But, you know, as I said before, Mr. Swan, the authority in the Constitution is passed on to each generation, and it's for the Congress to make the laws, the President to sign or veto those laws, and then the Supreme Court ultimately to review and determine the constitutionality of those laws. I think the founders considered it a living document and one that should be amended only under the terms by the Constitution, but accordingly. So 211 years of judicial history have established the parameters of that, and I think that's what anybody who comes into office has to follow. I disagree with your comment. The federal government is spending huge amounts of money, but that's not my fault or obligation. They doing that even before I started running for the office. And in fact, my tax cuts outpoint my spending increases by more than 2.5 to 1.
Thank you both. Finally, Mr. Dayton, what is your question for Mr. Gibson?
Mr. Gibson, you've pointed out several times that the federal debt is some $3.7 trillion owed to the public and almost $2 trillion owed from one account to another. What is your timetable for paying off that debt, and do you believe that the whole $5.7 trillion must be repaid? If so, how?
Well, first off, I want to say, Mark, I know you feel you have a bit of a home field advantage going to school here, but I want to say that when I was in high school, my brother and I would come over here and play soccer on those fields outside, so I think I have a bit of an advantage here too. The national debt, yes, I've made the case that you have to include what's owed to the trust funds. How soon that will be paid? We're talking about an extra $2 trillion. We're probably talking an extra 10 years beyond the 2012 date, I would say. It's important to recognize that what we owe there, because we can't declare the Social Security system to be solvent through 2037 unless we declare that there are valid assets there, and they're not valid assets unless they are liabilities to the U.S. government. That's the reason why we have to look at that overall debt of $5.7 trillion.
Thank you, and thank you all. Now, coming up a little bit later, you've seen the ads on TV, but what really is true? And what do these candidates think of all that? That's coming up later. But in just under a minute, we're going to begin taking live questions from our audience here at the Blake School in Hopkins, Minnesota. Stay with us.
We control our own destiny with our actions. For more than 100 years, a Minnesota company has been helping Americans build strong communities and strong financial futures throughout all of life's milestones. American Express Financial Advisors with the League of Women Voters urge you to help secure a strong future for you, your family, your community, and Minnesota. Control your destiny. Vote.
Welcome back. I'm Amelia Santinello. Now, this is the portion where we're going to start taking questions from our audience members here at the Blake School, and we're going to start with Alex. Alex, can you tell your name, where you're from, and what your question is?
I'm Alex Wabama. I'm from Burnsville, Minnesota. My question relates to having seen campaign ads on TV that pretty much mirror your party's presidential candidates' platforms, and I'm wondering if each candidate could take an opportunity to kind of share an issue where they might differ from that party platform that we usually see.
And we're going to start with Mr. Gibson. Remember, you have 1 minute to respond.
Well, Alex, the Independence Party of Minnesota is not affiliated with the National Party at this point, so the beauty of that is that I don't have to match up those platforms. And in fact, the Independence Party, I think, is a tremendous vehicle where candidates can pretty much state their own platforms. There's tremendous discretion. All we have to do is agree with a certain percentage of the planks, 70% of the cornerstone, 50% of the supporting planks. And it allows candidates to get up and simply pretty much say what they believe and function accordingly.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Mr. Gibson. We're going to go to Senator Grams. You'll have to answer the same question. Alex was wondering if the candidates for the Senate have the same stances where they differ from their parties.
Thank you very much, Alex. Well, they always say all politics are local. But the fact that I agree with George W. Bush on many of these issues, and I believe Minnesotans do, I think it shows that there's an overriding similarity or concern on the major issues across this country. And we're talking about how do we reduce the tax burden on average working people. In Minnesota right now, we pay about 42% of everything we make in taxes. That's an awfully high number, and I think we need to find some way to lower those taxes and allow people to keep more of those dollars in their pockets. Social Security. Governor Bush and I are both talking about how do we protect and preserve Social Security, not only for today, but to provide personal retirement accounts for the younger generations as well. And then, of course, with health care and prescription drugs. So there's a lot of similarities, and it's not that we're working together, but I think it reflects the concerns of not only people in Minnesota, but a very common theme across the country. Taxes too high, protect Social Security, preserve and protect Medicare.
All right, thank you, Mr. Grams. Now, Mr. Swan, the same question.
Alex, as a member of the Constitution Party, I have signed a pledge to uphold the party platform 100%. We don't have an option of picking and choosing the pieces that we want to follow. I would say this, I don't disagree with our platform. I have had no trouble with it, and I believe because it's such a simple, straightforward, plain language platform that's based on the Constitution, rather than on promises made to fulfill the wishes of our citizens that the federal government has no authority to do. That's what's the beauty of having a platform that's based on the plain language of the Constitution. When I go to Washington, you don't have to guess about whether I'm going to keep my promises or whether my promises have anything to do with real governance. They're based on the Constitution, and the limited powers that the federal government has are going to guide me. And I won't vote yes on a bill because it contains things I want when it contains things that violate the principles that I don't stand for. And that's what it means to be a principled party platform candidate. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, Mr. Dayton, the same question.
Alex, I'll confess I have not read either the Democratic National Platform nor the State DFL platform, so my presentation of my position on the issues are very much my own independent views from anyone else. I'm proud to be running with Vice President Gore. I think he will make an outstanding president. I don't agree with him on everything. I don't suspect he agrees with me on everything either. On health care, I would provide for universal coverage for all of our citizens. The Vice President starts with children and moves incrementally from there. On tax reductions, my tax cuts are far more broadly defined than his, which tend to be more narrowly focused. I'm for deductibility of college tuition. I'm for increasing the child tax credit and the child care tax credit. I'm for ending the taxation of Social Security, for making health care premiums and payments fully tax deductible. Those go beyond the scope of the Vice President, but we agree on almost much more than we disagree on.
I am Pat Kessler. I am here with Victoria Massey-Lorick. She is a 5th grader at Edison PPL. Do you have some of your classmates with you over here? You're the lucky one to ask the question, though, huh?
Yeah.
What is your question? We'll address it to Senator Grams first.
How would you make it so that our parents would not have to work 2 jobs and they could spend more time with us?
Senator?
And that's a great question, because that's what's missing a lot today, is because just this week there was a report says that there more than ever that there has to be 2 incomes in a family in order to try make it. And one of the biggest reasons cited in the report was because of the high taxes. So when there's a lot of reports out there that say, oh, we're not paying too much in taxes, and people really don't want a tax cut, When I've talked to the people across the state of Minnesota from one end to the other, one of the first things they say they would like to have is a reduction in taxes. Not these targeted tax cuts that Mr. Gore and Mr. Dayton talk about. In other words, jump through the hoops that we want you and we'll use the tax code for social engineering. But I would like to see broad-based taxes being lowered so that people can keep more of their own dollars in their pockets to care for their family. Right now they spend more in taxes than they do for food, clothing, and shelter combined. So if we can lower the tax burden, allow mom or dad to stay home, they can spend more time with the kids. And I think that's one of the key things we have to look at in this next Congress.
Mr. Swan, same question, please.
Well, if we would stop spending all the money that comes in to the federal government, Senator Graham's on Monday, I mentioned that the federal government's spent over $2 trillion since 1994 when the Republicans promised to make government smaller. They've spent over $2 trillion over and above the spending levels of 1994. This year alone, it's $600 billion in 1 year. And your response to that, when I said that the Republicans are just as big as spenders as the Democrats because the Republicans promised to make it smaller, your response was, well, we didn't raise taxes. Sorry, Senator, wrong answer, because you have spent most of the money that's come in. In fact, your $500 per child tax credit amounts to less than 1/1000th of the money that you and the Republican Congress have decided to spend over and above what they should be spending. Our plan is to eliminate the income tax to stop all of that unconstitutional federal spending, and you'd be amazed what you can do with 75% more money in your pockets and not giving that to the federal government. That's the plan that'll keep two parents from working.
Mr. Dayton, Victoria would like to know, how will you make it so their parents cannot work 2 jobs and spend more time with them?
Well, Victoria, that's an excellent question, and it underscores that even during this time of economic expansion, it's still very, very difficult for most Minnesota families, the parents, to make ends meet. And fortunately, with this economy's improving and a tight labor market, wages have been going up. But I believe that we must encourage that as Bill Clinton said when he ran in 1992, no one who works full-time should be poor. And certainly both parents working full-time should be enough that they can move their family into the achievement of the American dream. Providing health coverage for all of our citizens through the workplace means that if they work, they can take you and your classmates to get preventative care, to see doctors, to get the kind of treatment that'll keep you all healthy. That's what I would do: raise people's standards of living, raise income, make work pay off. And I have one last request. If you and your class would make my lawn signs, that sign you've made here tonight is so much better than that. I'd hire you all in a minute.
The 5th grade at Edison PPL, there they are. Mr. Gibson, will you please answer the same question?
Well, maybe if you hired Victoria, her parents wouldn't have to work quite so much. No, I just want to say, Victoria, I'm sure your parents would really like to spend more time with you, first of all. It's a great question. What really is at stake here are the wages people make, and I don't think, all due respect, I don't think the problem really are taxes. And David, you refer to the level of government expenditures going up, but as a share of our overall economy, they are down. They've dropped from about 22% to around 19% since 1992. And it's only natural that as we grow, that our economy grows, we'll want more government services, higher quality of government services. That ratio is really what's at stake here. And Senator, the 42% number just isn't realistic. The Tax Foundation uses a number which is a conservative institution, a number of about 33.8, and that's an average. The average family, which is below the average, if you will, hard to explain this, but for the average family's tax burden is much less than the 33.8. The issue here is the overall level of rise in wages, and what we need is a strong economy and a tight labor market. That's what we have, and that's what we need to continue.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Gibson. I'm here with Steve Gilmore from Delano, Minnesota. And your question, sir?
I would like to know the candidate's position on opening trade relations with Cuba to benefit Minnesota agriculture and other Minnesota businesses.
And we'll start with Mr. Swan.
Thank you. The question of how open we should be with a totalitarian regime is a complex one. Yes, we need to address the issue of farmers who can't make it because their crops are so low priced, they need more markets for them. But I'm sorry to invoke this, gentlemen, but again, we've had 65 years of the federal government trying to set agriculture policy, and we're still in the same mess we was in back then. Constitutionally, there's no authority for the federal government to manipulate the agriculture prices. It does have constitutional authority to set tariffs. And what I've noticed is that we have a real reluctance to do that. Should we open up the market to a totalitarian regime and allow them to benefit? It's a dicey question. I don't think that we should allow them to have any of our goods on credit or borrow money from us. If they want to get the money from somewhere else, I think that might be acceptable. But certainly we should not loan them any money to buy things from us.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Swan. And now, Mr. Dayton, your position.
I would be in favor of lifting the trade embargo with Cuba, resuming normal trade relations with everything except for military equipment and technology.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Gibson, your turn.
I support normalized trade relations with Cuba, lifting the trade embargo. This is a case where the United States has acted unilaterally. We're not in concert with the rest of the world. That causes the sanctions both to be ineffective, and it causes us to not appear reasonable. Other nations have chosen to trade with Cuba. This is a policy that has not produced the result that we intended it to produce, and over decades, it's time to end this crazy policy.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Gibson. Now on to Senator Grams.
Well, sir, in the 8 years I've had the pleasure to serve in the Congress, I've worked very hard to open the trade doors and opportunities for our farmers and really all businesses in the United States, because our future really is based on our ability to have access and to be able to compete in these markets. I worked very hard in the first years in the House to make sure that we passed NAFTA. I was a strong supporter and voted in favor of permanent normalized trade relations with China. I have also worked with the President and across the aisle with Max Baucus and Joe Lieberman to work on opening the doors and knocking down trade barriers, even with countries like Iraq and Iran, and with Cuba. In fact, Senator Chris Dodd and I authored a bill that would at least drop the tariffs on agricultural and medicines for Cuba to start with, and then work to see if we would raise any other tariffs or lift those embargoes. So I'm a strong supporter of that. For one, to help raise the standard of living for the Cuban people, and two, to improve our economic situation by giving farmers more markets in which to compete in.
And I am with Teresa Culpert. She is a member of the Church of St. Stephen in Minneapolis. Your question.
Thank you. At our church in South Minneapolis, St. Stephen's Catholic Church, we operate an emergency homeless shelter for 40 men. A recent survey of our shelter guests indicated that 40% of these guests have jobs but could not afford affordable housing. At the same time, Congress last year appropriated $44 billion more than the Pentagon requested for the military budget. What will you do to reduce excessive military spending and eliminate unneeded weapon systems in order to redirect funds to create enough affordable housing to meet the needs of those currently living in shelter?
We're going to start with Mr. Dayton on this question.
Teresa, I visited your shelter, and it's a remarkable dedication that your employees and your members of your congregation show, and it underscores the crisis in affordable housing, rental, and ownership in this state and across this country. Those who would advocate vouchers as a solution to other social problems should look at the experience of vouchers in the housing area. Back in the 1980s, the Reagan administration basically decimated many of the federal housing programs. The idea was we'll give a voucher certificate to those who qualify. They'll take those into the marketplace, and it will be built. Well, the private sector, and I don't fault the industry, they're in it for the profit, are going to the more lucrative upper ends of the market, and as a result, we have people in Minnesota across the state who have vouchers and cannot find any available rental or ownership housing. So we have to get the federal government back in the financial partnership with state, local governments, with nonprofits, not running these projects, but providing the financial resources, ideally so that nonprofits can build and own them.
Mr. Gibson, it is now your turn.
This is just one of a whole host of social issues that really are related to the kind of wages individuals make. And that's the source of the problem. We have to maintain policies which produce a strong economy and a full employment economy. In my entire adult life, we have never had the combination of circumstances we have in the last 3 or 4 years. There is nothing more imperative upon us as potential U.S. senators to encourage the kind of policies that maintain that kind of environment. Ultimately, that's going to solve this problem. Yes, we will have to intervene on a short-term basis, and I will support such intervention. I don't see particularly the connection between this and the military. Yes, there's money being spent that could be diverted, but I think the decision about appropriate levels of military spending will have to be made independently.
And now Mr. Grams.
Well, I would respectfully first disagree that we have overspent by $44 billion, if you said this year, in monies to the Pentagon more than they even requested. We followed pretty close to what the Pentagon and this administration requested. We have supported to add on a missile defense system, but that is over about a 10-year period of time. But those dollars have not come at the expense of monies from low-income housing at all. In fact, I've been a strong supporter. I'm on the Banking Committee, which oversees HUD and the housing situation. I'm not on that subcommittee, but work closely with it. And we did pass a bill that would expand dollars for low-income housing, to create incentives for more low-income housing to be either back into the system or built, and also to update and remodel existing low-income housing. But strangely enough, this bill was sponsored in the House by Representative Rick Lazio, and this bill is now being held up because Rick Lazio is the chief sponsor in the House, and there might be some political reasons behind it. But I'm hoping that we can move this bill out, and in these final days yet, pass it, which will provide, I think, much needed dollars for low-income housing.
Thank you, Mr. Grams. And the final answer now from Mr. Swan.
You're really asking two questions. One is, why are we spending so much on the military? And two is, what is the federal government's role in providing affordable housing at the state and local level? First of all, we're not spending enough on our military. I just read a letter from a retired Marine Corps colonel who described to me in great detail the sad state of morale in our military today. We do need to spend funds to bring their equipment and their personnel up to date and make them able to fight a defensive action on two fronts. We don't have that right now. Regarding the other question of the affordable housing, if I was running for county commissioner or state legislator or maybe even state auditor, I would address that question, but I'm running for a federal office, and the Constitution does not delegate that kind of authority to the federal government. I have been involved in a situation where I've seen a lot of waste of federal money that has trickled down to the local level. That money should never leave the state. It should be dealt with here, and those problems addressed locally.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Swan. Now, when we come back, something a little different. Stay tuned for a political free-for-all where there are fewer rules and we hope more answers on the issues as we continue our debate live from the Blake School in Hopkins.
When the dawn stretches across rural Minnesota, our hopes become renewed. Our dreams become closer to reality. Our neighborhoods and communities become stronger. Each day brings a chance to build a better Minnesota, because it's our Minnesota. Please vote this fall and bring a friend for a stronger voice. Do this, and tomorrow will be an even better day. This message from the Minnesota League of Women Voters and the Blandin Foundation.
Welcome back. We want to open up things a little bit more. Pat and I are going to be asking questions, and you guys can jump in a bit. Now, I do have a first question. It is from a WCCO radio listener from Don Shelby's show. He called in, and his question to the candidates are, would you consider lowering or replacing the federal income tax with a national sales tax? And we're going to start with Mr. Gibson, and remember, you have 1 minute to answer the question.
A national sales tax is a form of it's a consumption tax. And actually, there are real legitimate reasons for moving from an income tax to a consumption tax, where you begin taxing based on consumption, what you consume versus what you make. It would be tremendously motivating to an individual to know that the extra hour you worked, that money was entirely yours. However, I don't think we're there as a nation, because you need to get to the point where you can view somebody that makes $200,000 and spends $25,000 the same way somebody that makes $35,000 spends $25,000. If we ever get to the point where we view what you consume in this society as what you should be taxed upon rather than what we make, then we'll be ready to consider such a policy. Whatever would be proposed along the line, my chief objective is to make sure we don't cut into government revenues, that we maintain the kind of government revenues we have now so that we make progress in paying down the national debt.
All right, thank you, Mr. Gibson. Why don't we go to Mr. Dayton?
No, I would not favor such a proposal. The income tax is progressive, and it's far more efficiently paid and collected than imposing a sales tax collection requirement on every transaction. Senator Graham supports a bill that calls for elimination of the income taxes and other taxes replaced by a 23% national sales tax, but the economic experts say that that vastly understates the level of the tax that would be necessary to replace that revenue. It's more in the area of 30 to even 40% with no exemptions, as we have here in Minnesota, for food or for clothing or for medicine. Imagine seniors who already are being ravaged by these high medical prescription medicine prices having to pay then an additional tax of 30 or 40%. Same with farm equipment, machinery, cars. I think it's a poorly thought through alternative. I think it would have a very depressing effect on our economy. It would be very unfair for people of middle income who have to make these purchases. I think it's a bad idea.
All right, thank you. Mr. Dayton. Senator Grams, would you like to respond to that?
Well, I think Americans are hungry for a reform of our tax system. In fact, when I talk to them about tearing out this tax code by the roots, it gets a tremendous applause because they want something that's simple, fair, and easy to understand. Right now, this tax code is about 10,000 pages long, twice as long as the Bible with none of the good news built into it. We need to give it something that's easy to understand, it's simple and fair. Now, when Mr. Dayton says that it would have to be replaced realistically with a 30 to 40% national sales tax, doesn't that scare you out there? Doesn't that really reflect how much the government is taking from you now in order to support government? He's admitting that it could be up to 40%. I say it would be about 22%, but it would be a fair tax, and it would be based on consumption. You would be taxed according to how much you purchased. And by the way, it would be fair across the board, because if we would wring out all the taxes, the actual cost of goods would go down. So people would be able to purchase more. Yes, there'd be a tax on it, but it would be simple, fair, easy to understand, and it would not be the 40% that the government is taking from you today.
Now, a few political questions here for the next round.
Excuse me, could I answer the question?
Oh, Mr. Swan, I didn't realize you hadn't answered. Please go ahead.
Thank you. No, I would not support a national sales tax. It's fascinating to listen to these three gentlemen talk about not reforming the tax system, but simply rearranging it. Reform is supposed to make it better, and better means that you get to keep more of your money. What I'm hearing from all three of these gentlemen is that they want to keep government spending at the same levels. I'm the only candidate who wants to end the income tax, to cut federal spending, not increase it every year for the last 6 years like the Republicans have, cut federal spending to its constitutionally delegated powers, and then return that money to you. We can fund the federal government on its constitutionally enumerated powers with 25% of the money that's now being taken from us. The rest of it stays in your pocket. We can also fund it, its legitimate functions with a small national, we can fund it with the tariffs.
We're running out of time.
Yeah, tariffs, and with a small excise tax on some unessential goods and services.
Now, Mr. Swan, you've reminded me of something very important for all of the candidates. You can jump in at any time here in the midst of all of these questions if you would like to do that. We're going to have a little round of political questions here. I'm going to start with Mr. Dayton. Mr. Dayton, you have said on numerous occasions during this campaign that you want written on your tombstone that you were a member on the list of President Nixon's enemies list. You've also contributed funds to the Black Panthers, and you said you were the target of an IRS audit and FBI investigation. Mr. Grams has asked you to release the audit and the FBI files, which you say you have. Will you agree tonight to do that, to disclose publicly your FBI files? And if not, why won't you do it?
I'll release them tomorrow, that which I have.
What is in it?
Well, that's why you get to be there tomorrow.
You're teasing us, Mr. Dayton.
Details at 9
tomorrow. That big. Let me clarify a couple things.
Go ahead.
First of all, I contributed to the Black Panther Legal Defense Fund because there were people who were being held in jail for indefinite periods of time. I contributed to anti-war causes. I contributed to others. Nothing was ever brought against me or inferred in terms of any illegal conduct of any sort. I was engaged at the age of 23, 25 years old in lawful disagreement with the government of the United States. And I just remind you, the President of the United States resigned rather than face a trial after impeached. The Attorney General at the time, John Mitchell, went to prison.
Right.
The Director of the FBI, Pat Gray, resigned after it was shown that he had committed obstruction of justice. So I'm the innocent, law-abiding person in this.
Well, we'll look forward to the release of those files. Mr. Grams, Senator Mr. Dayton has asked you to make public whatever files you have about an Anoka County Attorney's Office investigation that your campaign may have been involved in possibly illegal anonymous emails to one of your political opponents. Do you deny that this happened, that you or anyone on your campaign did this, and will you make public what files you have?
Pat, I have said that I would, that my office has not been involved, and in fact, the truth is my office is not currently under investigation. There has been no request made of my campaign office for any materials or any computers. There was one taken from my staff member, a private computer from her home, but not investigation of my campaign at all.
Well,
and I would just say
that is one of your top political aides whose home, on executing a search warrant, that material was confiscated from her home.
But it was not involved with my campaign, so my campaign has not been called or questioned or is not currently under any investigation from this. So, but I would also refer to Mr. Dayton when he said he legally contributed to the Black Panthers Legal Defense Fund. But you got to remember, this is a group that was out to destroy authority and murdered many police officers across the country in an attempt to do that. This was a very subversive group that Mr. Dayton supported, and I think he needs to explain and be held accountable.
A smear. I mean, that's just untrue that I contributed money for that purpose, as you're implying. I contributed money for legal defense to get people who are being held for indefinite periods of time.
That's what I said, Mr. Dayton.
Gentlemen, can we get back to the issues that are pertinent to the Senate and the level of dignified debate that we need in the senatorial debate and stop this?
Mr. Gibson, this has been unrelentingly negative, it appears. This campaign has risen to a harsh level. Do you have any comments about that?
Well, I was just wondering if there's anything you wanted me to make public.
Anything you want. Yeah, well, how about your tax returns? We'll start with that.
The question you had to do with any comments I had on the kind of advertising going on, as I understand it?
Well, I think that Mr. Swan raises an interesting point here, that this has been very harsh last couple of weeks, and perhaps some people are calling it unrelentingly negative. Do you agree with that, and what has happened?
Well, I do. My campaign is probably the campaign that benefits the most from their negativity, so I can't say that I'm particularly... I can't say that I would like the negativity to stop from that standpoint. Didn't come out quite right, but no, I think, if I look at if I step back from this and I look at this, it would be nice if campaigns were run on a more dignified level and confined to issues and more factual. I think in politics there's a huge absence of facts, and the public ought to come out a whole lot more intelligent from campaigns, and quite often we just come out more confused because of this kind of activity.
Anything to add, Mr. Swan?
Yes, I'm not looking forward to further negative campaigns. I think it's beneath the dignity of this office that we're running for. I think it's beneath the dignity of the media to continue to bring these questions up, and instead of focusing attention on the issues, focus attention on these titillating things that really belong on a checkout stand at a supermarket. So I think we need to move past these things, all of us, and talk about the issues.
I just point out, responding to that, Mr. Swan, that I have offered twice now, and I'll offer again tonight, not to say anything negative about any of my opponents, to run only ads and other comments that are strictly about my positions on the issues, if others would do the same.
Your comment is sort of like my son saying, "She hit me back."
No, Mr. Kessler, I'd have to say it's a little bit too late, because Mr. Dayton has already run 24 different ads, and at least 6 have been negative, pointedly negative.
Senator Grams, we will get to those ads in a second, but let's
Well, I thought I could jump in at any time.
You can jump in. I just wanted to say that we are going to get to those ads. We want to ask what the candidates feel about the federal government's role in education. And why don't we start with Mr. Swan?
There is none. That's the short answer. The system of education we have today in 1983 was declared by the Grace Commission this way. They said if If this system of education was imposed on a country, it would be considered an act of war. We have switched in this country from a knowledge-based discipline approach to education to a therapeutic job training approach to education. It has been deliberate, it's been by design, and the Goals 2000, School to Work, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act that began in the 1960s, I think 65, all of these things have contributed toward a degrading of our educational system. There is no, and this has been known for decades, I mean, presidents from decades past have known that there is no federal role for education. The money that's spent by the government on education should remain in the states. States and localities should be able to fund their own education initiatives and not let the federal government be involved in this at all.
Anybody else?
Sure. I'm for increasing federal funding for education, elementary, secondary, especially through raising the federal support for special education to the 40% level that was promised over 20 years ago. I'm for making college postgraduate more affordable through deductibility of college tuition.
I think the federal government does have a role to play. It certainly has a role to play in special education funding and funding for poor students. But I also think there are going to be various projects that come along that are beyond the scope of what the states can handle. And I talk a lot about the use of technology in education, and some of the projects that involve technology, the kind of software that's going to have to be developed, and the infrastructure for developing that may have to be done at the federal level simply because the scope of the project is beyond what any one state can undertake.
Senator Grams?
I'd like to divide education into two parts, and that's higher education and elementary and secondary. And I don't believe the federal government has a major role in elementary and secondary education, but to provide funding, which I approve of, for special education such as IDEA and other programs. And I agree that we should support that with the full 40% funding that the government has promised. That would free up a lot of local dollars to do many of the other things like hire teachers or do the repairs that are being talked about. But on higher education, I think that's where the government can play a bigger role, the federal government, in providing loans and Pell Grants and the like in order to assure that those who want access to higher education can have it. But I would not support the federal government becoming more involved at the local level, basically taking the education responsibilities away from parents and teachers and school boards and rest that somewhere in Washington with the bureaucracy. Because if you go out in Washington and you ask them the names of the students here in Blake, and they couldn't tell you. But if you ask your parents and your teachers, they know every student here, so who cares more? I believe it's the parents and teachers, so I strongly support local control for elementary and secondary education.
That would not include the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which continues the mandate for Goals 2000 and School to Work. So if you support ESEA, Senator, I'm afraid that your answer is not correct.
I have voted against that part of it.
Congratulations.
Yes.
All right, thank you all for that. And when we return in a moment, we're going to take a look at the political warfare. Who is slinging the mud and who's telling the truth?
Now you're in trouble.
Target Corporation and the Target Foundation, on behalf of Dayton's, Mervyn's, California, and Target stores, encourage you to get out and vote. For more information on the candidates, pick up the League of Women Voters voting guide at any of our Minnesota stores or visit their website at lwvmn.org. Join our team members by casting your ballot in the September 12th primary and November 7th general elections. And take a friend to vote.
Welcome back. I'm Don Shelby, and we're now going to check out some of the campaign ads we have been seeing in the last few months that the candidates seem eager to talk about. We'll play the ad and then give each candidate 30 seconds to respond to it. First, from James Gibson. They'll be seeing it on the monitor.
Rod Grams and Mark Dayton have been slinging a lot of mud. Yet they won't attack James Gibson.
Come on!
Are his ideas flawless?
Come on!
Or are they scared? James Gibson, integrity. What a concept.
All right, Mr. Grams, would you please respond to what you just saw?
Well, I would say that Mr. Gibson's got a career outside of politics. But I disagree with the fact that I've been trying to throw mud. I've been really out there in my commercials and ads trying to really put some definition to Mark's plans, to Mr. Dayton's plans, which he refuses to do. He wants to paint a pretty picture, but he doesn't tell you who's going to control it, who pays the bills. So it's a great ad, Mr. Gibson. I think you did a great job. But I'm going to borrow some money from Mr. Dayton just so I can put an ad against and attack you that says that you don't like kids and you don't like dogs or cats or moms and dads, because that's the ads I have faced. But maybe if I can borrow some money from Mr. Dayton, I'll do that for you.
Mr. Swan, would you respond to the ad you just saw?
Cute. Marshall McLuhan said that the medium is the message, and I would say, Jim, that you've been successful in fulfilling his prophecy about our modern media age. Lacking in substance, but cute.
Mr. Dayton, would you respond?
I think it's a great ad, Jim, and I would say you're better looking with mud on your face than I am without.
Now we want to take a look at a TV ad paid for by the Grams campaign. Would the candidates please watch?
How can it be that people are making profit off of other people's illness?
Hold on, stop the buses. Is this the same Mark Dayton who owned hundreds of thousands of dollars in big drug company stocks? The Mark Dayton who got richer from those drug stocks got caught owning them and then dumped them to run for the Senate? The Mark Dayton who now wants us to believe he really cares about seniors and the high cost of prescription drugs? Hey, Mark, you must have taken one strange bus trip if you think we believe this.
Mr. Dayton, please respond.
Well, I think that's exactly the kind of negative and personally insulting ad that is beneath the dignity of a U.S. Senate and also beneath the standards of Minnesota politics by any responsible political party or candidate. I think it's distorting. It describes drug stocks that I sold in 1993 as though I held them today, and I think it's just indicative of Mr. Graham's distortions as well as his personal insults and invectives.
Mr. Gibson, would you please respond?
Well, Mark, you looked awfully guilty in that picture. No, I would have to agree with everything you said. I'd just like to add regarding my ad, if I could. I don't want to take credit. It was my campaign manager that did the whole thing. All he had to do was hold this cold mud and throw it, so just wanted to say that.
Mr. Grams.
Well, this was an ad where I was trying to really look at the hypocritical nature of Mark Dayton in attacking the pharmaceutical companies. In fact, in June or July, he made this statement: we're worried about the drug lords in Colombia and Miami, but the real drug lords are running the pharmaceutical companies in this country. Now, Mr. Dayton, what I was trying to point out here is that you were a shareholder. You owned a part of this company. You were an owner until you decided to run for the U.S. Senate, and then you decided to sell your stock to try to cleanse yourself. So you were basically, I believe, using this as a political campaign stunt rather than really the concern that was behind it. And that's what this ad, I think, was trying to show, and I thought it did show that.
Mr. Swan.
I wish you'd said that instead of produce that ad, because that has dignity, that treats him with respect, and that ad doesn't. And I think it does a disservice to not only Mr. Dayton and the other candidates here, but I think it does a disservice to the voters to run ads like that, because it tells them that you're trying to appeal to them on the basis of a sleazy, emotional approach. I think it really says to the voters that that's all we can expect of them, is to respond to the emotional appeal of an ad rather than the substance of the ad. And I'm really disappointed that you chose that tone in an ad like that. You could have said the same thing the way you did tonight, and it would have been much more respectful.
Up next, an ad that is actually running on the internet. It's from the campaign for David Swan. Watch.
Imagine your life with less government. The unborn are free to be born. Parents are free to direct the education of their children. Everyone is free from federal income taxes and the IRS. Seniors are free to choose their own medical care. Everyone will be free to invest in their own retirement. Let's return to the original contract with America, the Constitution. If you vote for what you really want, it can happen. David Swan for U.S. Senate.
Mr. Dayton, the camera's pointed at you.
I think it's a very good ad. I think it's very dignified in tone. It sets forth Mr. Swan's positions on the issues and got a great narrator.
Here's the $5.
This question then goes to Mr. Gibson.
I would agree with that, and maybe you have a career in those voiceovers afterwards. I thought it was a very high-class ad.
Thank you.
And Mr. Grams.
Thank you. I thought it was a very simple ad, but one that got the message out that you tried to get out, and again, the narration was well done.
Speaking as a professional.
Here's the $5. I got $10 from these guys tonight. That's great.
Go ahead with your response, Mr. Swan.
Yes. This is what I really want to see in a campaign like this. People who say things that are related to the issues and leave the histrionics and leave the hyperbole and leave the emotional stuff out. I believe that's the most respectful tone that we need to take. It dignifies our candidacy, it dignifies the process, it dignifies the voters, and I believe that we need to return. The Lincoln-Douglas debates, the first one lasted 12 hours. We're here for 1 hour. How much can we cover in that time? And the entire city of Peoria, Illinois turned out for that, by the way.
Willing to stay?
I'll be here.
Finally, a television ad from Mark Dayton's campaign.
Guns in school, a serious issue that deserves a serious debate. Rod Grams voted against legislation that would make it illegal to bring a gun into our schools or on school property. When asked about his vote in a recent debate, he denied knowing about it. Mark Dayton believes it's time to address the danger of guns in schools, threatening children and teachers. It's a matter of simple common sense. Guns have no place near our schools and our school children, period. The difference is real. Mark Dayton for Senate.
Senator Grams, would you respond?
Well, first of all, and Mark knows better than this, but I voted many times in the Senate to make our schools gun-free zones. And this particular vote came up, and even Rick Stanek, who chairs the Crime Prevention Committee in the Minnesota legislature, a police officer from the Twin Cities, said that we have laws on the books of Minnesota to handle this very question. This vote, to me, was taking away states' rights and replacing them with federal rights, and also not taking into consideration many states that might have different opinions or views. And Mark knew that, and he lied about my vote. He lies about or distorted my record that says that I somehow wanted to have guns in school. That is not true, and Mark knew better. And this ad, I think, showed some of the attacks that have been leveled against me in this campaign.
Mr. Dayton, a response, please.
The tough part about having a record, Senator, is that people can point to it. You voted on the record in this vote again, to kill an amendment that would have made it illegal, a federal crime, to carry a handgun on school property or on into the school itself. And you then, in a couple of our debates, criticized the administration for not prosecuting under that law, which wouldn't have existed if you had prevailed. You've said in the past that you voted then for the bill. That was a voice vote on the whole postal treasury bill. You know better than that, because you know this was a roll call vote where you sided with the NRA against the interests of Minnesota kids and schools.
See, there it goes to show that trying to distort my record, saying somehow I don't care about school safety or guns in school.
I said you voted as you did.
And he's distorting the vote. And this is, one of the problems I've had in this campaign. I can't match 24 ads on the air.
Mr. Gibson, you've heard this argument many times before. What is your response?
I have it. It tells me a lot about the campaigns. What we're looking at is our campaigns that are well-staffed. They've got people looking, researching all of the everything you ever voted on, Senator. And it's a bit disconcerting, because it seems to me the issues that are in play are here for everybody to see, and they're positive issues. They're issues we can talk about today without even referring back to some arcane amendment or whatever, without knowing the full context of it, for that matter, and the public doesn't understand the full context. And Mark, you've extrapolated from that and painted a picture which probably is beyond. I'm sure the senator is not for kids toting guns around in school, I'm sure.
I don't say what he's for or cares or doesn't care about. I say that on this vote, which established a federal law, I mean, this is what you get elected to the United States Senate to do. You vote for and against an amendment. This amendment passed 73-27, despite Senator Graham's opposition. It then became part of federal law. I mean, that's as real as it gets. You're either for the federal law being enacted or you're not.
How many amendments?
It was in 1997. It was the only amendment.
No, I haven't done the research, and I'm not. But how many?
Oh, I did.
How many bills? How many amendments did your research staff go over to find this one thing you could attack him on?
Well, but that's.
Let me just add one thing, though. Joe Lieberman voted with me on that same bill. Mr. Lieberman, who is now the vice presidential candidate. But again, Mark, this was, in my opinion, states' rights versus federal control. And the state of Minnesota had taken care of this. They have the law on the books. And I didn't think we needed to replace that with more big government out of Washington.
Senator, you're a senator voting on a federal law that applies to all states, many of which did not have Minnesota's law on the books. The federal ban is actually stronger than the state.
I can solve this whole thing, gentlemen. Excuse me. My mother always said, boys, if you're going to fight, go outside.
No, David, come on.
Thank you very much. I'm going to have to interrupt you there.
Let me solve this very simply.
Very quickly. You're cutting into your own closing time if you can't continue.
This is what voters should have a right to know, differences of opinion on issues.
All right, thank you all. We're going to close tonight with a final statement from each of the candidates. Each of the candidates will have 30 seconds. We're going to start with Mr. Dayton, please. Mr. Dayton, 30 seconds.
I was told that I was
closing statement.
Okay. I'd like to sketch just briefly the kind of public leader I would be if you elect me to the United States Senate. In Marshall, Minnesota, out in front of the Lyon County Courthouse, there's a bust of Hubert Humphrey which says, after listing his accomplishments, his public life exemplified the premise that politics can be an honorable profession. A few weeks ago, I had the privilege to spend part of an afternoon with former Governor Elmer L. Anderson, who served as the governor of the state for one term, was defeated by 92 votes for re-election after being smeared at the very end of that campaign by specious charges that turned out to be false. But he went on to become Minnesota's #1 citizen, running a business which provided health insurance for all of its employees, long before I thought of the idea, which his support for the university and his philanthropy, a remarkable man. These two men led their lives with dignity and honor, and that's what I would attempt to follow if I'm elected.
Thank you. Now a final word from the Constitution candidate, David Swan.
If you want to run this country over the cliff of socialism at 100 miles an hour, you should vote for Mark Dayton. If you want to run it over the cliff, but stay inside the speed limit, you should vote for Rod Grams and the Republican Party, because their spending record in the last 6 years shows that they support the same ideals. If you want to go somewhere in between, vote for James Gibson, because he defines himself as being between these two gentlemen. And he wants to increase the level of government services, not make it smaller. If you want to reduce government to its constitutional levels, vote for David Swan.
Thank you. Now a final word from Senator Grams.
And of course, I want to thank Blake School, the League of Women Voters, and WCCO-TV for hosting this debate. 6 years ago, Minnesota voters sent me to Washington to do a job, and I've demonstrated the leadership that it has taken to get that job done. I promised I would cut taxes. I did, with the $500 per child tax credit, and I pledged to work with President Bush to double that to $1,000. I promised to help save Social Security. I've done that with the Grams lockbox that sets away those surpluses, and I'm going to make sure we have a private investment account for our young generations that they can have a better retirement. And I promised to work to help save Medicare and prescription drugs. I have done that as well, introduced a bill to make sure that our seniors who need the help will get it. I've demonstrated the leadership. I've reached across party lines to get the job done, and I ask for your vote on November 7th.
Thank you. And finally, a closing statement from Independence candidate James Gibson.
I also want to thank the League of Women Voters and Blake High School for hosting this event. My campaign is about what I call intergenerational justice. It simply means making decisions which create the kind of world we want down the road. My message is about sacrifice, responsibility, maturity, courage, just simply being willing to make decisions that create a better life next year, the next year, 5 years down the road, a better life for our kids and our grandkids. And I ask for your support on November 7th.
Thank you to the candidates. Thank you to the Blake School. And thank you to you who watched. Good night.